Ci disponiamo a iniziare la quarta sessione ascoltando.
So we are going to start the fourth session, and we will listen to our secretary, Father Paciolla. As you know, Father Sebastiamo Paciolla is a Cistercian monk. He studied canon law, and he also works at the Rota Romana. He is also commissioner of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith and the Congregation for the Clergy. He has written many books, and today he is going to talk to us about consecration from the perspective of canon law. Father, you have the floor.
Buonasera a tutti.
Good evening, everyone. Let me first of all explain the title of my presentation. The title is quite unique, Ius Sequitur Vitam, which means, literally, law follows life. I have wanted to use these words that somehow explain the wisdom of the ancient fathers to present some of the aspects that concerns the juridical dimension of the theme that we're dealing with. That is, consecration and consecration through a profession of the evangelical councils. Now, let me first of all make a fundamental introduction. When we talk of theology or the Holy Scripture, the Sacred Scripture, we see how at times the presentations of the speakers are very diversified depending on the perspectives that they embrace. In the seminar, during this seminar, I was held in March, we saw that the theme of consecration lends itself well to many different interpretations. This is true when we talk about history or the scripture or theology, ecclesiology also. And also the speakers that we heard yesterday, but also today, presented some unique traits, some peculiar interpretations of a phenomenon that concerns us all. When we talk of law, it is impossible to have many and diversified interpretations. Why so? Because the dogmatic data provided by the theologians and magisterium, they pick up a juridical aspect in the canon law. So my presentation will try and present the reality of consecrated life at the baptismal specific levels. And I will try to highlight the different types of consecrations, and as the seminar 2 months ago intended to do, and as this conference also intends to do, I will try and provide some suggestions, especially with regards to themes that require further exploration. When jurists talk about law, we make a distinction between de jure condendo and de jure condendo. What do they mean? That is, the law that was approved and the law being approved, that is about to be approved. So we want to try and see how 50 years after Vatican II, we can talk from a juridical standpoint of consecration, baptismal consecration, and of consecration through the evangelical councils. Another introduction, by way of introduction again, I need to say this on the strength of the teachings of John Paul II, who in 1984, a year after the promulgation of the Code, said that the Code of Canon Law, promulgated on 25th of January 1983, was the a council document. So in other words, you cannot understand the Code of Canon Law without knowing the outcomes, the documents of Vatican II. But as the code contains 1,752 canons, well, it is clear that the wealth, the richness of the Council cannot be cannot fit the code. Now, this introduction was essential because, on the one side, a jurist, has a specific task. In fact, during the seminar, but also during this Congress, we have referred to some texts of the Council of Vatican II, which are fundamental to us. Lumen Gentium 44 and Perfecte Caritatis 5. Unfortunately, I do not have enough time to also provide you with an exegetic interpretation of these texts, which are fundamental to make a distinction between baptismal consecration and consecration through evangelical councils. Now, the code relies upon this distinction, which we always have to bear in mind, because we should not mix up this word that, as we said in the introduction, runs the risk to become a little bit vague if we only consider consecration, the word consecration, without having any adjective attached to it in order to give it a clearer meaning. Now, as the Code of Canon Law is actually the last of Vatican II's documents, the doctrine of Lumen Gentium 44 and Perfecte Caritatis 5 is at the basis of the code, especially when it comes to consecrated life. But exactly because the code is law and it cannot contain the richness of the theology of Vatican II, but the fundamental sentence, the fundamental idea of Vatican II, that is, that we have one and common consecration, that is our baptism. Well, in the code, this expression is not so clearly stated. So the Council told us we are consecrated on the strength of our baptism, and the code considers this consecration from the juridical viewpoint and completes this truth. Now, we have basically three canons that I'm going to quote, because they actually give us the contents, the gist of baptismal consecration, and they are 96, 104, and 849. Canon 96, which is in the general norms, gives us some very precious information, even if it is often neglected. By baptism, one is incorporated into the Church of Christ and is constituted a person in it. To be constituted a person in it means to have both rights and duties. Canon 204 brings us back to the notion of Christi Fidelis. The Christian faithful are those who, in so much as they have been incorporated in Christ through baptism, have been constituted as the people of God. And in this canon, the lawmaker highlights the fact that they are incorporated in the people of God, a people of baptized people. And then Canon 849 lists the spiritual aspects connected to baptism, which is defined according to the patristic dimension, the gateway to the sacraments. Now, what are the spiritual effects of baptism? Freedom from sin, to be reborn as children of God, and to be configured to Christ by an indelible character, and to be incorporated in the Church, and so on. Now, we may easily realize that the sum of these three canons expresses the truth which is contained in Lumen Gentium 44 and reasserted in Perfecte Caritatis 5. Now, if we consider the continuity between the Council teachings and the ecclesiastical law, well, it appears clear that the consecration, religious consecration, is quite different from the baptismal consecration. In fact, the new consecration has something new compared to the baptismal consecration. It is a consecration which is grafted onto the baptismal consecration. It also entails a diversity of degree of intensity. Now, just like baptism generates a specific, a special relationship with the one and triune God, because we become children of God. We are creatures of God, but we become children of God, co-authors, and so we become children through baptism. Well, the baptism also links us to the Church as people of God. So all of these effects are renewed and strengthened and amplified on the strength of the profession of the evangelical councils. We follow Christ more closely, and we do so under the action of the Holy Spirit. We belong to the Church thanks to baptism, but in the Church we become an eschatological sign, and so on and so forth. So we devote ourselves to God with a new title of honor. What does it mean? We are all dedicated to God. We are all consecrated to Him thanks to the baptism. The profession of the evangelical councils, which is grafted onto the baptismal consecration, makes us devote ourselves to God with a new and special title of honor. So we understand that besides any interpretation, we need to be able to distinguish between these two consecrations. Now, the baptismal consecration that we have just outlined, and I wanted to describe it because some authors say that the Code of Canon Law does not expressly state that the baptized is consecrated, or rather is a consecrated person, but implicitly we know that the doctrine of the Council was reasserted also in the canonical form. And if we look at Canon 573, we may appreciate the difference, the distinction between the consecration, baptismal consecration, and the consecration through the profession of the evangelical councils, which, in order to be distinguished from the fundamental ones, we call specific consecration in literature. I always say that the words need to be understood in the text and in the context in which they were uttered, because at times words that are used in an ambiguous way may generate confusion and misunderstanding. Now, Canon 573 is an example of something that inspired the whole code of canon law. In fact, an old Latin rule says omni definitio in jure periculosa. Every definition of law, of canon law, is dangerous. Why? What does it mean to define? In Latin, definire means to outline, to draw clear-cut lines. And once you have defined something, when you have marked a border very clearly, you cannot touch it, you cannot change it anymore. So dogmatic definition, once it has been proclaimed, it cannot be changed. And the lawmaker, in a very wise way, has not wanted the Code of Canon Law to contain any definition whatsoever, but simply the code contains descriptions. Now, the description from a juridical standpoint gives let's say, outlines a topic, but it does not prevent us from perfecting, from reviewing it in the future. So this is very flexible. The lawmaker has wanted to make this code very flexible. And Canon 573 contains the description of consecrated life in its most essential elements. If you've studied the code, you may remember that Canon 573 was very wisely built because it is basically divided into two paragraphs. The first one is about consecrated life, a life consecrated through the profession of the evangelical counsels. And I would add, with regards to the theological contents, you could organize a whole training course on this first paragraph of Canon 573. And if we start from this first paragraph, we may see all the effects of the first baptismal consecration, the way in which they are enhanced, amplified, and highlighted in the specific consecration through the profession of the evangelical counsels. Second paragraph, which is more technical, more juridical in nature, gives us some technical aspects of consecrated life. In other words, it tells us where we can find it, where we can find consecrated life. It also provides us an answer. Consecrated life can be found primarily, but not exclusively, in institutes of consecrated life that for centuries have only been religious institutes, but for the intuition of Pope Pius XII, a new form of consecration, of secular consecration, rose, and it became a different type of consecration, a new form of consecration. So Canon 573, paragraph 1, contains the theological ideas of the specific consecration, whereas paragraph 2 tells us where we can find this consecration and how. Now, normally, we talk about consecrated life and its various forms. The Code of 1983, for the first time ever in the Church, offers a range of possibilities of consecration that was quite unprecedented in the Church. First of all, because next to religious life in all of its various expressions and forms, for the first time in a Code of Canon Law, we see secular institutes. In the Code of 1917, secular institutes, that didn't exist. The 1983 Code, for instance, mentions the ancient Ordo virginum, Canon 604, which is the pre-Christian form of consecration in the pagan world. As the pagan world knew the consecrated virgins or the circles of virgins consecrated to the gods, then Christianity picked up this form of consecration from the pagan world, and over the course of history, the various consecrated virgins started to join to form some communities. This is how the feminine monastic orders were born. Canon 603 mentions the anchoritic life, the hermetic life. This is also one of the oldest form of consecration known to man. Probably this was also present before Christianity, before Christ, but then in the experience of the desert and in the first communities, this was turned into monastic life. And the code also includes the realities of the societies of Apostolic Life, which were already present in the code of 1917, but they had a bit of a special name. They were called Societies of Common Life Without Vows. But next to these forms, these new forms, well, let's call them new, but they were not new. Anyway, Canon 605 presents the reality of the new forms of consecrated life. The history of consecrated life can be summarized in a part of the Code of Canon Law, the third part of the second book, and it calls the Church people of God. So the code here describes the various forms of consecrated life. Many canons concern religious life, secular institutes, societies of apostolic life. Just one canon concerns the hermits, one concerns the Ordo virginum. Canon 605 opens up the possibility to new forms of consecrated life. Now, and as this canon is new, and as many realities actually refer to this canon, I think that we probably should expand this reality. Well, we should focus on this reality of new forms of consecrated life. Let us start by clarifying the terminology. New forms. Now, what does this expression hide? Well, in the literature, we find many realities which are quite different from one another. For instance, we have the new communities, new institutes, new forms, or various expressions that lead us to the right of association, which is natural law, natural right, and it is also governed by the canon law, especially with regards to the baptized. So it is clear that this diversity of denominations is due to some numbers of the Apostolic exhortation Vita Consecrata, and especially number 12 and number 62, that contain the contents of the Propositio 13. That was one of the pillars of the reflection of the Synod. I mentioned the communities of evangelical life. Now, so we had, well, the term various forms embrace various realities. I can tell you that not everything that calls itself a new form of consecrated life actually is a new form of consecrated life. In fact, there are some publications that try to make a sort of list, a summary, if you want, of these so-called new forms. I have counted around 300 new forms. But as there is our Dicastery is actually competent for these new forms, well, I can tell you that there are not even 30 new experiences of life which aspire to be recognized as expressions of new forms of consecrated life. And then, the concept itself of new form, it would have been better and even more correct to talk about other forms of consecrated life. Why? Well, because if for instance, an institute like mine that has a rule that was written over 1,500 years ago and that was endured a reform over 900 years ago. I mean, we are what you would call an old charism. Well, we also started to think about the concept of novelty. Now, these new presences, these new forms, why are they called new? Are they new in terms of contents, in terms of theology, in terms of structure, for all of these different aspects put together, for the various states of life? So you see, when we talk about religious life, which has become crystallized over the course of the centuries, well, we can take Canon 607 and say, well, a religious institute is a society whose members proclaim public profession, and through that they embrace evangelical councils, they live together, and they are separated from the world according to the charisma and the spirituality of the institute. Now, the form of religious life, though in the diversity of the charisms, has its own juridical structure, public vows, fraternal life, a separation from the world. Now, if today a founder wants to establish a religious institute, he shouldn't invent a model, because there is already a model. And the same applies to secular institutes. The problem arises when the intuition of the founder is something new compared to the approved forms. This is why the Holy See and the bishops need to discern the meaning, the sense of new form. We should also be aware of the way in which we use words. During the seminar, a question was asked. A new reality that emerges, is it a new form or a new institute?
Ci vorrà del tempo ancora.
It will take time to define what a new form is.
Sono voluti
Because since it took centuries to understand what identifies a religious institute and how the very secular institutes from the first Company of St. Ursula to the approval of Provida Madre Ecclesias by Pius XII, well, there has been an evolution in order to identify the specific traits of a specific consecration, particularly because for centuries the only type of consecration specific to the Church was that of the religious, and the consecration of secular members did not have some elements that up until yesterday seemed to be essential in order to be speaking about consecration. So the Dicastery, since 1983 to the present day, decided to examine very carefully these realities that have emerged, helping them to identify from a legal standpoint also the intuition of the founder And among the possibilities that can lead to the recognition of the various forms, we have a specific structure, which is that of the ecclesial family, that is not in the code, in which, de facto, we have a certain structure which unifies the male and female branches of the ecclesial family, to which the branch of the laity is attached as part of a reality which shares and participates in a common charism. Of course, within the ecclesial family, the statutes or the different rules will regulate belonging and the governance of the various branches and of the whole ecclesial family. I have to move forward because time is running. If we have a baptismal consecration, which is common, Canon 207 states that within the only people of the baptized, which is the Church, there are two roots of inequality or difference. One is a sacred order, and if we keep this as reference, we distinguish in the Church the clerics and the laity. The other, which is still in Canon 207, is the profession of evangelical councils. So, based on this criteria, we have baptized people who are consecrated to God in their own fundamental expression, and consecrated who are consecrated to God in a specific dimension. And so, hence the importance of understanding the different adjectives. During the seminar, what came up was also another reality, which per se is something that the Dicastery has been reflecting on, but as we said earlier, it does not fall within the direct remit of the Dicastery. In other words, we have in the Church this phenomenon of associations, and in ecclesial movements, we have groups of faithful who define themselves as consecrated people. But these groups of faithful people who define themselves as consecrated per se have made no profession of evangelical councils, so they are not part of that stable form of life which is represented by the profession of evangelical councils, as we were reminded by Canon 573 in paragraph 1. So how should we define this consecration? Is it linked to baptism? Is it a pseudo-religious consecration? Is it a tertium quid? Here we have to give some clarifications, and it may be framed within this expression. The difference between lifestyle and form of life, so style of life and form of life, and I explain. I try to study these groups or expressions of consecrated people who are within the various movements. And within various movements, I found the presence of so-called consecrated people corresponding in terms of their lifestyle to the 5 forms of consecrated life which we find in the Code. Within the movements, there are groups who have a common life and under a superior. So what would normally happen in a religious community? Within the movements, there are individuals who embrace chastity for the kingdom of the heavens, so an equivalent to the Ordo virginum within the movement. In other movements, there are some who consecrate themselves without telling the others, in a climate of privacy and confidentiality concerning this personal and special consecration, that make them very similar to a secular institute, and so on and so forth. So there are situations which, based on their lifestyle, are very similar. But the basic difference which I noticed is precisely this form of life. Why? Because these consecrations within the various movements belong to the sphere of baptismal consecration. They are a form through which a faithful or a group of faithful people want to live out their own baptismal consecration. In other words, the great difference beyond lifestyle is that within the movement or within the association, you don't have that notion of stable form of living, which is typical of consecrated life, where there is a pathway that you need to follow to be admitted, and there is also a pathway to be followed if you want to leave this order. The comments of the authors concerning these experiences of consecration that are the expression of baptismal consecration make us understand the importance that from a theological standpoint you need to try and understand, to try and find the appropriate interpretation of these phenomena. We can content ourselves with saying it's a way of living out the baptism and that's it, or we can go beyond. And here the jurist stops, because what happens is that the theological fact is turned into law by the jurist, and life experience then becomes a rule. But if from a theological standpoint there are no clear assumptions or starting points, the jurist will never expose himself or herself to giving a meaning to what is not clear. So law follows life. And this has happened in the case of all the expressions that were gradually recognized within the Church. And this is also the case with us. As to terminology, so during the seminar, we talked about the fact that sometimes words are inadequate to express some truths. Consecrated life expresses what it actually means. Well, the seminar explained how we got to this expression, the various meanings of consecration, and so on and so forth. But the same goes for the word charism and what we call the charism of the founder, of the founding, or of the institute. These are facets that are very different, particularly because from a legal standpoint we make a difference in the various meanings that sometimes in spoken speech are not really understood. The expression consecrated life it is inadequate to express the richness that it encompasses, but this is the term we have, the word we have at the moment. And until we get another word in the future, we need to make reference to this expression. But we need to be careful, because we started from a topic which is in Lumen Gentium and Perfecte Caritatis, and after 50 years since the Council, even though the code, which we call the New Code, but it's a code that dates back to a few years, where some ideas and some concepts have not yet become a part of our lives, and sometimes we cannot describe who we are within the Church, and even the value of our specific consecration, even though we made it by and embrace a stable form of living. The provocations that lie before us are many. One of them is particularly related to shedding further light on what we call societies of apostolic life. I did not get into this topic because it's very complicated as well as technical. But societies of apostolic life in the Latin Code have been added as an appendix almost to consecrated life, while authors disagree on considering all expressions of apostolic life a real consecrated life through the profession of evangelical councils. When we speak about the various forms of consecrated life, we said that primarily consecrated life is found in institutes and also in hermit life and also in the new forms. But when you speak about Ordo virginum or when you speak about societies of apostolic life, then the legislator uses a verb, accedunt. They are similar to. And these are words that we should delve deeper into, because it's simple to say we have got 5 forms of consecrated life that have been approved, plus the new forms, plus Ordo Virgin, the Order of Widows, all our other realities that the Spirit may bring to expression. But if a reality accede is similar to, it means it's a reality that is not fully something. And here raises the issue of evangelical councils in the plural that are not mandatorily present according to Canon 791/31, and that are not all professed by the Ordo Virginum. So there are some food for thought in terms of deepening, and also because the theme of societies of apostolic life was set aside in the past decades. And even further, the need we increasingly feel for interdicasteriality. At the moment, consecrated life through the profession of evangelical councils, because of the right or of the territory, falls within the competence of 4 dicasteries in the Roman Curia. So ours, the Congregation for Oriental Churches, the Congregation for the Evangelization of Peoples, and the Pontifical Commission Ecclesia Dei. But because of the connection we spoke about with what has to do with the movements within the Church, and this deepening which becomes necessary from a theological standpoint to start with, and also from a legal standpoint, to also the dicastery for the laity, family and life becomes competent, or at least should be an interlocutor in a deepening that is very much required. Sister Carmen, when she presented the works that we are going to be dealing with tomorrow in our groups, spoke about the facts if the law we have is adequate. In terms of it being an instrument concerning what we already know, yes, but then because the law follows life, what is a starting point becomes the end of a step, and it becomes an opening towards something else, towards the next step. So we need to make theological deepenings concerning what are new forms, concerning the real content of a consecration, or at least the various explicit aspects of a consecration, and the comparison I made looking at the text of the code may be a starting point, but the jurist has a different role compared with that of the theologian, the biblical foundations for some aspects, and because jurists are accused of mortifying the spirit, I wish to conclude this dissertation by thanking you for your patience, first of all, and quoting a short excerpt by John Paul II. Every code of canon law in any language opens with an apostolic constitution, Sacred Disciplinary Leges, which at the beginning was read and commented in all the courses of canon law, but since 1983 only the nostalgic do so. And it is a document that is very precious, that refers to the role of law in the life of the Church. Quote, it appears quite clearly that the code has not in any way the goal of replacing faith, grace, charisms, and particularly the charity of the faithful in the life of the Church. But rather, its goal consists in creating this order in ecclesial society, which, by focusing on the primacy of love and charisms, makes life easier, and at the same time, their development in the life both of the ecclesial society and of the individual persons who belong to it. The code as the principal legislative document of the Church, and so on and so forth. So the code does not replace the spirit, the grace, and the charisms, but it becomes an instrument of ecclesial communion that sets out to everybody the way to follow. Thank you very much for your attention. Let us thank Father Sebastiano for the clarity of his presentation, which has expressed so well the meaning of canon law at the service of consecrated life. Now we shall continue as we did before with our dialogue. We're going to take 3 questions and then the speaker will answer. Thank you. I would like to ask Father Paciolla. I was a little bit surprised the difference he made between lifestyle and form of life, because according to what he said at the beginning of his presentation, he spoke about this essential basis represented by baptism, and baptism in both cases as a lifestyle in the form of lay consecrations, and it is also so in the case of the other forms of consecrations, religious, secular institutes, but still the root is still baptismal. So I didn't really understand this difference. And then when he spoke about this stable form of living, then I think that in this case perhaps we should get more into the details concerning the action of the Church, which is different depending on the institutes and the structures. Well, not the institutes, perhaps the private associations. Well, in their case, there is a public action of the Church that is different compared with the case compared with the religious institutes and etc. According to Canon 573, don't you think that in Canon 573 there is a concept of consecrated life which is unique and that involves all forms It is so rich and dense that it overflows, the canon itself overflows. And it also refers to these forms of private consecration that the Church respects because they are a form, there are associations they want to be. They don't want, however, to be more committed with reference to a specific stable form of living. But I think that perhaps there is only a single notion of consecrated life. There are not many. Then, of course, the styles and the form of living changes. They may differ, but I would like to know what you think about this.
I would like to ask my question in English. I'm a consecrated virgin from the United States. I'm also a canonist. And I would like to ask Father, even though in the Ordo Virginum, consecrated virgins don't literally profess vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, but the propositum of virginity is meant as a gift of one's entire life and self. So my question is, might it be possible to conceive of this as implicitly including all of the councils? That's my question.
Yeah, first I'd like to say thank you for a very interesting and very descriptive presentation of the juridical aspects. First, I noted that you said that the canons are, if I understood you correct, is a description and therefore they can be revised and not seen as definition. It brings me to question, when we talk about the evangelical councils, if the canons are descriptive, what is it that the Evangelical Council actually expresses? Could it be that sometimes when we start to define things and start to make laws, we often get into even more trouble because we can't really capture what we try to define? So I wonder, is consecrated life more than the Evangelical Council, which tries to express what it is, but can it really express what it is? Is it? It's been a way, perhaps, to describe, to express, but what is the core exactly? So that's what I wanted to ask. Yeah.
Rispondo perché 3 persone.
So I will answer. We had 3 questions, but in actual fact, there are more questions behind these questions. The first question, the relationship between style and form. Well, the relationship between style and form is something that I mean in terms of the experiences outside consecrated life that we find within the movements. In other words, every form of consecrated life, secular or religious institute, has its own lifestyle that has been defined in the code and in the constitutions. But through the life of the institutes, you get into a stable form of living. So it is the full adhesion to a specific consecration. What I wanted to say is that sometimes in the literature, but also in experience, one bases oneself on the lifestyle to say something that legally is not actually that. And I make an example. If I go live in a wood on my own and I feed on roots and I spend my whole day in prayer and contemplation, am I a hermit? This is the question. No. I make a hermit experience, but to be a hermit, I have to profess the evangelical counsels in the hand of the bishop and abide by a rule that is given to me by the bishop. This is the hermit according to law. Now, we have today in the church a great confusion because there are realities that in theory seem to be a certain thing and that live a certain experience, believe that that experience is something that should be recognized. So what I'm saying is a hermit that professes himself in the hands of the bishop is a person who has followed the form of life of hermits. The hermit who goes camping in the woods are those who take on a lifestyle, but a lifestyle does not always correspond to a form of living. This is more or less what it is in simple terms. But it is also true that you can have institutes that have been recognized by religious institutes that have had pontifical recognition, but then in practical life they behave in a way that is totally different compared with the way in which they should be behaving. So we need to be careful. Now, baptism, it is true that it is a common consecration, but then baptism is the beginning of the pathway of holiness as the children of God, according to the style of living that the Lord brings you to choose. Now, the stable form of living, which is the legal elements within the Canon 573, this consists in a series of acts that the Church has identified to give strength to a charism, to a possibility of discipleship, approving the rules, the institute, the constitutions, etc. So the superiors are elected, but they receive their power from God through the ministry of the Church. This is what the Code reminds us of. So it is clear that the stable form of living is a consequence of a choice. But before personal choice, there is a discernment by the Church which recognizes the intuition of the founder, approved the possibility of the Sequela Christi, that recognized the institute in terms of being a diocesan institute, an institute of pontifical law, and so on and so forth. When we speak about Canon 573, it is a description, but it is a description that has become part of a law of the Church. So law, by nature, is something that establishes something. So description is prescriptive. So we did not adopt definitions so that we can take action in the sense that in 100 years' time we may have a description of consecrated life that is going to be very different compared with what we have today. So it will be enriched by other details. And if that notion of consecrated life overflows the canon itself as this was described, all the rest that is not a stable form of living may refer to the canon, but by analogy, because it has to draw inspiration from that concept, but to draw something, not the total identity. Otherwise, we would all be consecrated in a specific form. As to Ordo Virginum, the form of consecration of virgins is very ancient, pre-Christian, and it has found many representatives in the Latin and Oriental Fathers and in St. Ambrose. It is a dedication to a service of the Church, to a holy proposition. When the discourse on the three evangelical councils had not come up yet, my rule does not make me profess poverty, chastity, and obedience, because it was written a long time before that medieval summary that we are all indebted to, that among the various evangelical counsels that are offered by the person and the example of our Lord, just chose some as being more characteristic, because patience, humbleness of Christ, etc., are just as many evangelical counsels that draw inspiration from the person and from the life of and the word of Jesus. Then this aspect too, let us not forget that evangelical counsels are given to the whole of the church. The religious embrace them with a public vow. The other forms, well, depending on the way in which the statutes or their own laws establish in terms of adopting the evangelical counsels. But evangelical counsels per se are a gift from God to the church. And moreover, the three evangelical counsels that have been understood as identifying the life of Christ. Today, we never speak about the imitation of Christ. We talk about discipleship of sequela, but particularly in the Middle Ages and in monastic life, it was not shocking to speak about imitating Christ. Anyway, we speak about this sequela, but we have to be careful because sometimes, even in some handbooks, this sequela seems to be something romanticized, while the objective content of the sequela can be found through the content of evangelical counsels that are applied to the whole church, but that for us religious people have been described in 3 canons, and in just a few lines we are given the theological foundation and the legal consequence of the evangelical counsel, which religious people embrace through a public vow, profession, and the vow, canon 1191, is a promise made to God of a better good, and because it is a promise to God, it has to be fulfilled by virtue of religion. The ancient notion dates back to St. Thomas Aquinas, and it is referred to by the Code, because very often we make a profession and we cannot make a distinction anymore between the virtue of poverty, of the evangelical counsel of poverty, and the vow of poverty. Sometimes it's embarrassing asking these questions to people who say they are consecrated in a specific way and they cannot describe the content of their own consecration.
Credo di aver risposto alle 3 domande.
I think I answered the 3 questions. I would like to add something. Again, along the same lines of this. Now, we are in a moment in which we also need to discern true founders from genuine founders from, let's say, fake founders. We're studying about 15 fake founders, and we need to make a distinction between genuine founders and bad founders, and we need to ban them. That is why discernment is so important for us. This is absolutely vital. It is very, very important. And then the evangelical councils, vows that we mentioned. Well, currently, we have around 40 institutes that are under a commissaire that have been commissioned. The Holy See is trying to help them go back to the straight and narrow, and at times it is very, very painful. So the Pope urges us to discern. This at times starts with just one person, and then it extends to a group, and then to the bishop. And in my view, this is absolutely vital for all of us. And I'm saying this simply to try and help. And then there is, again, another element in our culture, and the current culture, which is a bit complex, and this especially refers to formation. Our young people try to be happy, and also us, the older generation, tries to find happiness. And when the candidates reach the stage of the vows, well, after the vows, they tell us after 3 or 5 years, I'm no longer happy and I want to leave in order to find true happiness. So this is a peculiar situation. These are problems that we also need to take into consideration in consecrated life, especially in view of the working groups that we will have tomorrow. I would like to make a comment, especially on a situation which is quite concerning, and this again along the lines of what the prophet said. Discernment is so important, but at times it does not exist really. We have to be very clear about it. On 2 occasions, we asked the specifications of Canon 579, which gives authority to the bishops to erect a new institute. And we asked 2 things. First, the Dicastery had to be consulted ad validitatem, and secondly, the opinion of the Dicastery should be followed, should be complied with. And then in the end, they gave us candy, I always say. They're trying to somehow sweeten the pill. We asked this twice, and also on behalf of the plenary assembly of our congregation, sees the attendance of many superiors general, cardinals, and bishops. We asked these unanimously, and they gave us some candy, simply saying that we need to be consulted ad validitatem, but then they can do whatever they like. And we are seeing that often there is no discernment whatsoever. That is why then many problems emerge, as the prefect highlighted. We also asked something else. So we hope that this will be accepted. And the thing is this, many superiors, general, both male and female, they have some difficulty with their members of their congregations who drop out of the congregation. So after a long discernment, we asked to include in the code to the 2 reasons for a demission, ipso facto demission, which already exists, that is the loss of faith and wedding, marriage, to add a 3rd element, which is after a year of illegitimate absence, this religious or consecrated person should be dismissed ipso facto, because otherwise it's total chaos, really. So at the moment, we are confronted with abnormal situations in a religious life. And we also try to help canonists follow canon law, but actually canon law should follow life. And let me tell you that today the Holy Father talked about 2 provinces who declared the euthanasia. They declared a spiritual euthanasia. Unfortunately, from what I know, this happens even more frequently, much more frequently. When I just started my service with Daniela, who's here among you. Well, we visited a country, I'm not saying which, I'm not saying which country, and they openly spoke of convoking the last general chapter. We will write a spiritual last will and testament, which I call the charismatic euthanasia, but they called it spiritual testament. Well, I thought of St. Francis' spiritual testament, but there was nothing of that in these testaments. And this testament basically declares the death of the charism, and the charism, and well, this especially applies to female religious, and the charism and the members of that institute are entrusted to a lay foundation or a lay association that then would manage the goods and also the members. For instance, this lay association would tell these members when they had to meditate or pray or where to go on a stroll. So the reality is even worse than we think. We have to be very precise. And we, unfortunately, continue to put various institutes under a specific, special administration. And also, many founders, for instance, demand a fourth vow, even written in blood. No, I'm talking about reality. This is the reality. We also have pictures of this. Unconditional obedience to the superiors, but then they do not obey the Pope, because they believe that they have a direct line, direct connection to God. And I'm really sad, this really saddens me, because it is not consecrated life, even if they are institutes of pontifical right. Let me add something. Well, there actually is a problem. At times, new families, new religious families or new religious groups are created in order to solve pastoral problems. And at times, well, it's the bishops who step in this. Then the bishop changes his diocese, transfers to a different diocese, and then he would abandon his children. They become orphaned, even if they're very young. And they are widows, really like widows or orphans, because they lose their identity. So we need to actually discern very well. And there's also a third phenomenon that we are confronted with. There is an actual division. There is some infighting within a certain group, and then from there, a new group is generated. So we need to actually see whether the reason is charismatic or it is problematic. Now, let me add that well, at times those who wish to leave a congregation, well, probably they have some charismatic problems, but I believe that most of them they have problems with the authority. Also, because in the past, the majority of the superiors were originally from a certain continent or from certain continents. Nowadays, instead, those who have the majority, they will be elected. And maybe those who had authority in the past, they do not want to be subjected to new cultures and so on.
Que llevo desde la vez anterior que no he podido hacer la preguntita, que es solamente una pregunta.
Sorry, I couldn't ask the question. I only simply have one question. With regards to what you said, well, I believe that you are right. Our founder just recently passed away, and we do have some problems of division in our association. These are difficult and very complex moments. At the same time, it is also true that the approvals of the various associations, which would be the first step, approval would be the first step, and His Eminence is right, at times bishops do not know, maybe for lack of experience in canon law, they do not know how to go about with this type of approval. For instance, in my group has followed this lifestyle for the past 30 years, and now the successor of our foundress said that maybe this style is not convincing, it is not appealing. So we question not simply the lifestyle, but also the life of people. And then with regards to what someone said from up there, well, it seems that St. Augustine approved that families could live together, ecclesial families, I mean. And the Church approved this from the very beginning, and we have no problem in terms of poverty. We have no problem with sharing. Maybe the religious find it harder to share, whereas families have fewer difficulties in sharing because families put everything that they have in common. Of course, I'm referring to the ecclesial family. And in our association, there are families with many children who share what they have because we put everything that we have in common. Another problem that we have, also this concerns priests, is also a problem of education. In my association, we have both priests and lay people, and priests always feel superior, and the same goes also with religious women, because we believe that we were chosen, that we are above the others. And today, it is important to also think about our life of consecration, to include the laity who have their own specific consecration. Nowadays, in our association, there is a great support between the religious, the laity. My family belongs to an association, and I joined this association with my family when I was 6. When I was aged 6, and now I am a superior of a group. And I understand that there are problems among us.
Solamente que me digan quién nos podría asesorar a nosotros como asociación pública que somos.
So who could help us? We are a public association, I'm not saying it right here in this moment, but then I would like to actually talk to you about this point, this problem, the problems of public associations. Well, tomorrow we will have these groups that I believe will be instrumental for sharing, for exchanging ideas. This was going to be very important. And then, depending on your ecclesial identity as a lay or as institutes, well, I do not know what your identity is, because I think that you are an association. So probably you could be you could address one of the Dicasteries, because we want to help you. But I think that you should follow the right path so that you shouldn't have any difficulty. Well, we need to see whether the association is an in itinere association that is approved, so that in the future will become an institute of consecrated life, or whether it is merely an association of faithful that renders a service to the diocese. Depending on this, there will be a different, you will have to resort to a different dicastery. Then in this case, if the founder has not managed to bring a certain project to completion, the first group of his companions will complete the charismatic intuition, and the difference between charism of the founder's charism or the founding charism, which once approved becomes the charism of the institute. So if you lived with the founderess, you will probably you will have understood or seized some ideas that you will continue to bring forward. And then when you have a bishop, this bishop will have some competencies vis-à-vis the other bishops in whose diocese the association of the Institute will spread to. Before the Vespers, we need to receive some announcements. We will have some announcements, and then we will have the Vespers.